The democracy is a way of government that includes the participation of the people and where the population selects their governors and how they will govern. This is done by a vote in which the majority wins. The capitalism is an economic system of getting more money for their own benefit or government in general and the head of many companies.
African reality. Naturally, Africans had a somewhat different understanding of their culture and institutions in the 19th century. While it is impossible to generalize about the entire continent in a few sentences, it is accurate to say that the continent that produced the first humans and which developed universities as early as the 11th century was in a state of turmoil by the 19th century. Much of the cause can be traced to the resumption of regular contacts with Europeans beginning in the 15th century and the impact of European expansion on the Muslim world. Among the consequences were 1. The development of the overseas slave trade, which created African states whose power was based on guns. 2. The end of the overseas slave trade in the early 19th century, undermining those states, mostly along the coast, which had grown strongest due to slave trade. 3. Muslim reform movements that developed in response to the adoption of some aspects of European modernization by the Ottoman Empire, the center of the Muslim political world. 4. The expansion of the trade in slaves and ivory along the East African coast, following efforts to end the slave trade in West Africa. 5. The proliferation of guns obtained from European and Muslim resources. European military officers often had a more realistic view of Africa, at least after serving a few years. As the French learned in West Africa, the coastal states in Senegal were small and relatively weak, but beyond the town of Medine and in the upper Senegal River Valley, two large interior states were still healthy enough to block French efforts for roughly 40 years. The leaders of one of them, Samri Touré, created an empire by employing smiths to manufacture guns, using Islam as a unifying ideology and making an alliance with the business community of long-distance traders.
The metaphor of the Great Game describes the power competition between Russia and Great Britain in the 19th century over the future of Central Asia. It describes a period of Russian expansion and the moves made by Britain to counter what they thought was Russian aggression in Central America. Indeed, the Great Game was a stake that was just greater than Central Asia. The stake was India. There was a perception that Russia's ambition would not limit to incorporating Central Asia. Central Asia was a getaway into Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was a getaway to India. At the beginning of the 19th century, in Japan occurred significant changes in terms of economy, politics, and democracy. During the 18th, the Japan economy was closed for other countries. They have an isolationistic policy, but in 1853, Tokugawa shogunate opened the trade with other countries on the ports of Nagasaki and Kanagawa. After a while, Europe too. Now Japan is communicated with other countries. The Qing government wanted to stop the import of opium. The conflict between the two countries started the Opium War in 1840. China lost the war. In the Treaty of Nanking signed 1842, China not only gave its rights to prevent the import of opium, but was forced to give Hong Kong to the British and open its rivers for British shipping. China's government became a lot much weaker after the defeat. The Chinese people were humiliated and angry at the British and the Qing government. At conclusion, we can see that the 19th century was a period of economic growth since the government began to change laws and made a big impact in the people. In terms of democracy, the democracy grew with the reforms. One of the most important significant change was that the women could vote.
The independence of Mexico. The independence of Mexico started in the midnight of September 16 in 1810, when the General Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla started a rebellion to finish with the government of the Spanish people. One of the principal causes was that the government of the Spanish people was very unjust for the Mexican and for the natives, and the natives were treated like slaves. And one of the consequences was the rebellion of the natives and the start of independence of Mexico that bring a lot of deaths in the country. Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was from 1846 to 1848, and there was a fight between Mexico and the United States for the territory of Mexico. This started with the independence of the Alamo, that was the incorporation of Texas with the USA. One of the principal causes was that Texas tried to get the independent and make a rebellion, but the army of Santana calmed down the rebellion, but the night after the rebellion ends, the American attacked the army of Santana. And one of the principal consequences was the loss of the 55% of the Mexican territory: Texas, California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and part of Colorado. The Porfiriato. The Porfiriato was from 1876 to 1911, and there was the age of the government of Porfirio Diaz that made a lot of change in the Mexican history. During the Porfiriato, the Mexican economy were very high, but not for the people, just for the government. This was because Porfirio Diaz made an industrialization in Mexico, like the Vías Férreas, and Porfirio get that a lot of countries invest in Mexico, like USA, French, Spain, etc. But for the town, there wasn't a good age, because Porfirio Diaz wasn't just. This was because the town were divided into social classes, and for the low class, the workers, was very difficult to live because the salaries weren't good. One of the principal causes were the Battle of Tuxtepec in 1876, when Porfirio Diaz get into the power, and one of the principal consequences was the industrialization in Mexico and the start of the Vías Férreas. During the 19th century, the democracy of Mexico wasn't very good because there was a lot of fights and the government doesn't pay attention in the people, and the capitalism were kind of good with the Porfiriato because a lot of countries invest in Mexico. With this, the economy of Mexico get bigger and the capitalism were better.
The War of 1812 was a military conflict lasting for 2.5 years, fought by the United States of America against the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, its North American colonies, and its Native American allies. Great Britain and France were at war each other. Great Britain did not want the USA to provide the French with food and supplies, so they set up a Persia blockade. British impressed or kidnapped American sailors and forced them to work on British ships. The war broke the strain of Native Americans who had sided with the British. It was a conflict between the United States and Spain that ended Spanish colonial rule in the Americas and resulted in USA acquisition of territories in the Western Pacific and Latin America. The US had been waiting for the appropriate moment to intervene in Cuba to seize new territories outside the country. When they realized that the Cuban insurgents were close to defeat the Spanish, they intervened in the war to snatch the victory from the Cuban and tried to keep Cuba. The Cuba did not allow to be ruled by the USA, and therefore the USA were forced to grant them their independence. But the Platt Amendment that allowed them to intervene in Cuba was in the spring of 1861. Decades of severe tensions between the northern and southern United States over issues including states, right versus federal authority, westward expansion, and slavery exploded into the American Civil War. It lasts from 1861 to 1865. The practice of slavery threatened to destroy the United States. Northern voices called slavery barbaric, while southern voices claimed slavery an economic necessity. The Civil War was by far the deadliest war in American history, where over 600,000 people died in common from disease or as a result of the Civil War.
This was a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire to control the area of Crimea. Crimea was a geostrategic position, and in terms of military, this was the door to control Europe, Africa, and maybe Asia. For this reason, many European countries were allies of the Ottomans, like French and British. One cause that started this was the Crimean geographic importance to Russia. The consequences of this war were the deaths of thousands of people. When this conflict ended, Germany and Italy had the opportunity to unify against Austrian opposition. This event was caused by the fear of the southern German states to French, so they signed alliance with the Northern German Confederation. One consequence of this unification was the victory of Germany in the war between France in 1870, where France had to pay a large sums of money and give two territories because with the unification they were stronger. During the 19th century, the European societies began to view other countries as a source of raw materials. Another thing that is added is that Europe wants to sell their products in other countries. Most of the European countries want to grow in power. That means that they want to have a better economy, more territory, and other things like that. One consequence that we can see in this process was the influence that left many imperialist countries in the others that were conquered by them.
That happened, we can see how democracy really grew in that time thanks to the events like the unifications, where they seek a common good. In other cases, we see that countries struggled to continue with their own democracy and not be forced to another form of government, like in the Crimean War. But in case of the imperialism, we could say that democracy is paralyzed, because during this process, you could see cases where the majority of the people with the same goal obtain objects with this form of government, in which the majority wins, but in others, we looked at the people as slaves, used for a
Independence of Chile. On September 18, 1810, Chile broke from the Spanish monarchy, declaring independence. People thought that they should govern themselves, and the independence of the United States inspired the criollos in Chile to be free. The declaration led to a decade of violence and warring until the Spanish collapsed in 1826. The Chilean independence movement was led by criollos who wanted political and economic independence. What started as a political movement against their colonial master finally ended as a full-fledged civil war. Traditionally, the process is divided into three stages: Patria Vieja, Reconquista, and Patria Nueva. After the independence war finished, democracy increased a lot.
Independence of Brazil. Some of the causes of the independence of Brazil were the establishment of a monarchy and legal reform by the Portuguese in Brazil, and that no Brazilian was included in the imperial government. The independence of Brazil comprised a series of political events that occurred in 1821 until 1824, most of which involved disputes between Brazil and Portugal regarding the call for independence, presented by the Brazilian Empire. The anniversary of the September 7, 1822 date, Regent Prince Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence from Portugal. Formal recognition came with a treaty signed by both Brazil and Portugal in late 1825. Anglo-Brazilian Treaty was signed in 1830, establishing that the slave trade would be illegal. Brazil's first democratic form of government came in 1889, and the First Republic lasted until 1930. Then Getulio Vargas dictated 15 years until the Second Republic in 1945. The Triple Alliance War. One of the causes was Brazilian expansionism. The idea was to keep control of the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso, acquire temperate zones, population increase of the European race, get good soils, etc. The most devastating war ever fought in South America, the War of the Triple Alliance, pitted Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil against Paraguay. When Uruguay was attacked by Brazil and Argentina in late 1864, Paraguay came to its aid and attacked Brazil. Ironically, Uruguay, then under a different president, switched sides and fought against its former ally. By the time the war was over, hundreds of thousands had died, and Paraguay was in ruins. It would take decades for the nation to recover. The Triple Alliance killed 75% of the Paraguayan population. Much of the private wealth and the state disappeared. And Argentina and Brazil annexed to their territories Paraguayan lands. Democracy and capitalism in Paraguay was strongly decreased because of the war.
The war between England and Alexandria. This battle was in Alexandria when England sent an army to conquer Alexandria. But when the British arrived, the Albanese defeated them. Causes. The causes were that the city didn't recognize the reign of Mehmed Ali. So with that, the England government sent an army, but they failed because the Albanese was waiting for the British. Consequence. One consequence was the defeat of England and the death of around 400 British people. And another was the treaty of peace that Mehmed Ali did with the British. The Russian-Persia War was from 1804 to 1813. This war started like a battle of territory when Fath Ali wanted to extend his territory to the north, the Caspian Ocean, and the Russian Tsar Alejandro wanted the same, so this finished with a battle of territories. Causes. The idea of extension between the Russian Tsar Alejandro and the Persian Tsar Fath Ali. Consequence. The Treaty of Gulistan was a peace treaty concluded between Imperial Russia and Persia on 1813 as a result of the First Russo-Persian War that have these two countries in peace until 1826. The Suez, located in Egypt, is a 101-mile-long canal that connects the Mediterranean Sea with the Suez Gulf, a northern branch of the Red Sea. It officially opened in November 1869. Causes. The commerce was very slow, so with the opening of the Suez Canal, the commerce was much more easy to transport to other countries. Consequence. The majority of the economy for all the countries who transport merchandise, especially cotton, like we can see, those historical facts benefited the capitalism, like we can see it in the Canal of Suez, and also we can see that the democracy was affected by the diverse action.